All right, let's dive in. Today we're tackling a topic that always sparks debate and discussion. The differences between male and female brains. You guys know we love to get into the nitty-gritty, so we're going deep into the research to uncover not just what these differences are, but how they actually play out in our lives.
It's fascinating stuff, and it's easy to get caught up in oversimplifications. So taking this deep dive will give us a more accurate and nuanced understanding.
Absolutely. And the goal here isn't to say one type of brain is better. It's about exploring the unique strengths of each and seeing how those strengths contribute to everything from our career choices to the way we navigate relationships.
Exactly. It's about appreciating the diversity of the human brain.
Okay, so let's start with one of the most common myths out there. Brain size. For ages, people have claimed that men's brains are bigger, therefore they must be smarter. But the research you sent paints a different picture.
Yeah, that's a classic misconception. While it's true that men's brains are about 10% larger on average, that difference is largely due to body size. It's not about raw volume, but rather the internal wiring that matters most.
So it's more about the brain's architecture than the overall square footage.
Exactly. And one of the key structural differences is the distribution of gray matter and white matter.
Ah, yes. You sent me some fascinating research on that. Can you break that down for us? What's the significance of those two types of brain matter?
Sure. Think of gray matter as the processing centers of the brain, where information is analyzed and decisions are made.
Okay, so the brain's control center.
Precisely. Men tend to have more gray matter, which might explain their inclination towards task-focused activities.
And women have more white matter. What does that mean for their brains?
White matter acts like a communication network. It connects different regions of the brain, allowing them to work together seamlessly.
So it's like the brain's superhighway system.
Exactly. And this might explain why women often excel at multitasking. They're able to juggle multiple thoughts and tasks simultaneously.
Interesting. So men might be better at focusing intently on a single task, while women are wired for a more integrated, holistic approach.
That's a good way to put it.
Hmm.
And this difference in processing style even shows up in brain scans.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Researchers have found that when men and women are given the same task, their brains often light up in different areas.
So even when we're doing the same thing, our brains might be taking different routes to get there.
Exactly. And this raises the age-old question of nature versus nurture.
How much of this is hardwired versus influenced by our experiences?
That's the million-dollar question.
Mm.
It's likely a complex interplay of both. Our brains are incredibly adaptable. They're constantly rewiring themselves based on the input they receive.
Okay, so we've got these structural differences, but how did they come about? I know you've looked into the evolutionary perspective on this, and I have to say, this is where things start to get really interesting.
The evolutionary angle offers some compelling insights.
Yeah.
Think back to our hunter-gatherer ancestors. Their roles, the skills they needed to survive. These likely shaped brain development over countless generations.
Right. The men were often the hunters. They would have needed sharp visual-spatial skills and focused attention. Imagine tracking prey through dense forests, navigating unfamiliar terrain, aiming a spear with pinpoint accuracy.
Exactly. And those skills align perfectly with what we know about male brain strengths. Spatial awareness, mental rotation, target focus.
And the women, while also capable of hunting, often took on roles that required different skills, gathering food, caring for children, nurturing social bonds.
Precisely. And those roles would have favored different abilities. Verbal communication, reading social cues, emotional intelligence. All strengths we see in the female brain.
It's like those roles shaped our brains over millennia, leaving us with these inherent differences we see today.
It's a compelling theory, and it makes you wonder how those ancient influences are still shaping our behavior in the modern world.
It's mind-blowing when you think about it. So we've talked about brain structure and evolutionary roots, but what about specific cognitive abilities? Where do we see these brain differences playing out in real-life skills?
One area is spatial reasoning. On average, men perform better in tasks involving mental rotation, spatial navigation, and judging distances.
Like those guys who can parallel park in a tiny space without breaking a sweat. I've always envied that skill. But isn't there also a difference in how men and women navigate?
Absolutely. Research has shown that men tend to rely more on cardinal directions, north, south, east, west,
Got it.
whereas women are more likely to use landmarks and relational cues.
So a man might think, I need to go 2 blocks east, while a woman might think, turn right at the big oak tree, then left after the flower shop.
That's a great way to illustrate it. It highlights how even something as basic as navigation can be approached differently based on these inherent brain differences.
That's fascinating. And what about other cognitive areas? Where do women tend to excel?
Women consistently outperform men in verbal fluency, reading comprehension, and emotional intelligence. They tend to have a larger vocabulary, process language more quickly. And they're better at understanding subtle nuances in communication.
So men might excel at reading maps while women are reading people.
You got it.
Yeah.
And again, this makes sense when you consider those evolutionary roles we discussed.
Right. Women being responsible for child rearing and social cohesion, they would have needed to be masters of communication and emotional understanding.
Exactly. It all starts to connect, doesn't it?
It really does. It's like these differences aren't random. They're linked to our evolutionary history and how our brains have adapted over time.
It's a fascinating puzzle, and we're only just beginning to grasp its complexity.
Well, this has already been so insightful, but before we go any further, there's one concept that I really want to unpack. You mentioned it in your research,
Yeah.
the gender equality paradox.
Yes. It's a concept that often sparks debate and challenges some of our assumptions about gender inequality.
It definitely caught my attention. From what I understand, it suggests that in societies with greater gender equality, we actually see more divergence in career choices between men and women.
That's right. As societies move towards greater equality, we might expect men and women to make similar career choices. But the data tells a different story.
So it's not that women are suddenly less capable in STEM fields, it's that they might be choosing different paths based on their interests and strengths.
Exactly. It suggests that when societal barriers are removed, innate differences in preferences and inclinations might become more pronounced.
Wow, that raises so many questions. What are some of the explanations for this paradox? And what implications does it have for our understanding of gender and equality?
Those are exactly the questions we'll be exploring in the next part of our deep dive, so stay tuned.
That gender equality paradox really has me thinking.
It definitely challenges some conventional wisdom.
It does. But before we dive into the explanations, I'm curious to explore some other areas where these brain differences we've discussed actually manifest themselves like in behavior.
Great point. We've talked a lot about cognition, but behavior is where we see these differences play out in the real world.
Exactly. And one area that comes to mind is risk-taking. You know the stereotype of men being the daredevils, always up for a challenge, pushing the limits. But is there scientific evidence to support that? Or is it just a social construct?
Well, it's interesting. Research has shown that men, on average, are more likely to engage in risky behavior, whether it's financial investments, extreme sports, or even just crossing the street against the light.
So there's some truth to the stereotype, but what's driving this difference? Is it biology, culture, or a bit of both?
It's likely a combination of factors.
Mm.
We know that testosterone, a hormone that's more prevalent in men, plays a role in risk assessment and reward-seeking behavior.
That makes sense. But I'm also wondering about the evolutionary angle. Could this risk-taking tendency be linked to the roles our ancestors played?
Absolutely. Think about those hunter-gatherer men again. They were the ones venturing out into the unknown, facing dangerous predators, pushing boundaries to secure resources for their tribes.
So taking risks was essentially woven into their survival.
Exactly. And those who were more inclined to take risks might have been more successful in those roles, passing those genes down through generations.
It's fascinating how those ancient pressures could still be influencing our behavior today.
It really makes you think about how much of our personality is shaped by our evolutionary past.
It does. Okay, so moving on from risk-taking, another area where we see clear gender differences is in social behavior. It's often said that women are more social, more focused on relationships and nurturing connections. Is there any truth to that?
There's definitely a lot of research to support that claim.
Yeah.
Studies show that women, on average, place a higher value on social connection, and they invest more time and energy in building and maintaining relationships.
And this isn't just about gossiping with friends, right?
Right. It's about providing emotional support, nurturing bonds, creating a sense of community.
Exactly. So what's behind this difference in social orientation? Is it purely biological, or do societal expectations play a role?
It's probably a bit of both.
Okay, let's unpack that. On the biological side, are there any brain differences that might contribute to this greater emphasis on social connection in women?
There are a few key players. One is oxytocin, often called the love hormone or cuddle hormone.
Oh, I've heard of that.
It plays a crucial role in bonding trust and empathy.
So it's released during those feel-good moments, like hugging or cuddling.
Exactly. And studies have shown that women release more oxytocin in response to social interaction than men do.
Interesting.
So there's a biological basis for their heightened sensitivity to social cues and their drive to connect with others.
So the biological piece, lays the foundation.
Yeah.
And then societal expectations come in and shape those behaviors even further.
Precisely. From a young age, girls are often encouraged to be nurturing, empathetic, and to prioritize relationships.
Whereas boys might be told to be tough and independent, to hide their emotions.
Exactly. It's those classic gender stereotypes that can reinforce these differences.
It's like this complex interplay of nature and nurture that ultimately shapes how we interact with the world.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, so we've talked about risk-taking and social behavior. Now let's talk about another big one, emotional processing. Do men and women actually experience and express emotions differently?
Research suggests they do.
In what ways?
Well, women tend to be more verbally expressive with their emotions. They're more likely to talk about their feelings, analyze them, seek support from others.
While men might be more likely to internalize their emotions
Yeah.
or express them through actions rather than words.
That's a common pattern. Men often cope with difficult emotions by withdrawing, engaging in physical activity, or finding distractions.
It's like that classic image of a man retreating to his man cave to process his emotions.
Exactly. And there's actually some interesting brain science behind this.
Oh, tell me more.
Neuroimaging studies have shown that women tend to process emotions using both hemispheres of the brain.
Really?
Yeah, this leads to a more holistic and nuanced understanding of their feelings.
So they're literally using more brain power to process emotions?
It seems that way. Men, on the other hand, tend to process emotions primarily in the right hemisphere, which is associated with more visceral and action-oriented responses.
That makes sense. It explains why a woman might want to sit down and talk through a problem, while a man might just want to go for a run to clear his head.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that neither approach is inherently better or worse. They're just different strategies rooted in brain wiring.
Absolutely. Understanding these differences can be so helpful in relationships. It allows for more empathy and better communication.
Couldn't agree more. So much conflict could be avoided if we all had a better understanding of how the other sex processes emotions.
Okay, before we move on, I want to address some common myths and stereotypes that surround these gender differences, because there's a lot of misinformation out there.
I agree. It's important to separate fact from fiction.
So one myth I hear all the time is that men are terrible multitaskers. Is there any truth to that?
Well, it's not as simple as that.
What?
While men might be more inclined toward focused attention on a single task, that doesn't mean they're incapable of multitasking. It's just that women with their greater white matter connectivity might find it easier to switch between tasks.
So men can multitask, but women have a bit of a biological advantage.
That's a good way to summarize it. And it's also important to remember that practice and experience play a huge role. Anyone, regardless of gender, can improve their multitasking skills with practice.
That's encouraging. Another myth that I find really frustrating is the idea that because men and women's brains are different, one sex must be inherently better than the other.
Right. That's a harmful and misleading oversimplification. The differences we've discussed are about diversity, not superiority.
It's about recognizing that each gender brings unique strengths to the table.
Precisely. And it's this diversity that makes us stronger as a species.
It's like comparing apples and oranges, both fruits but with different flavors and textures. Neither is inherently better, they're just different.
Exactly. And it's those differences that allow us to complement each other and achieve great things together.
Love that analogy. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Brain structure, evolutionary influences, cognitive abilities, behavioral differences. And we've even busted some myths along the way.
We've laid a solid foundation for understanding these differences.
But how do we apply this knowledge in practical ways? How can it actually improve our lives?
That's the key question. We don't want this to just be an intellectual exercise. We want to use these insights to create positive change.
Absolutely. So where do we start? One area that comes to mind is education. If we understand how boys and girls learn differently, can we tailor our teaching methods to better suit their strengths?
Definitely. For example, recognizing that girls might thrive in collaborative learning environments, while boys might benefit from more hands-on activities.
So instead of trying to force everyone into the same mold, we can create learning experiences that cater to individual needs and learning styles.
Exactly. And this applies not just to gender, but to all forms of diversity in the classroom.
That's a great point. And what about the workplace? How can this knowledge improve teamwork and collaboration?
Well, understanding that men and women might approach problem-solving or decision-making differently can lead to more balanced and effective teams.
So instead of seeing these differences as obstacles, we can actually leverage them as strengths.
Precisely. A team with a mix of men and women might be able to approach a problem from multiple angles, considering both the logical and emotional aspects, leading to a more comprehensive solution.
I love that. It's about using our diverse perspectives to our advantage. And what about relationships? Can understanding these brain differences help us navigate the complexities of love and partnership?
Absolutely. Recognizing how men and women communicate and process emotions differently can lead to more empathy, better communication, and stronger bonds.
So instead of getting frustrated when our partner doesn't react the way we expect, we can try to understand their perspective based on their brain wiring.
Exactly. It's about meeting each other halfway, recognizing that there's no right way to be or to behave.
Yay. This has been so insightful. I feel like I'm starting to see the bigger picture. But before we wrap up, I want to circle back to that gender equality paradox. We left off with the observation that greater gender equality doesn't necessarily lead to more similar career choices.
Right.
So what are some of the possible explanations for this phenomenon?
That's where things get really interesting. There are a few schools of thought on this.
All right, let's unravel this gender equality paradox.
It's a fascinating puzzle.
It is. So remind us again what the paradox is.
Essentially, it's the observation that as societies become more gender equal, we don't necessarily see men and women making more similar career choices.
You'd think more equality would lead to more convergence.
Right. But in many cases, we see the opposite.
More divergence.
Exactly.
So what are some of the leading explanations for this?
One theory is that as traditional gender roles loosen, people feel freer to pursue their genuine interests, even if those interests don't align with societal expectations.
So it's not that women are suddenly less capable in STEM fields. It's more that they might be choosing different paths based on their passions and strengths.
Precisely. When those societal barriers are removed, those innate differences and preferences might become more pronounced.
It's almost like we're seeing people's true selves emerge.
Exactly.
But does this mean it's all about biology then? Like our genes are dictating our career choices?
Not necessarily. It's more nuanced than that. While biology might play a role, we can't ignore the influence of our environment.
Right. Our upbringing, our education, our exposure to different fields, all of these factors contribute to who we become.
Absolutely. It's that complex interplay of nature and nurture again.
Always coming back to that.
And another theory is that even in societies striving for gender equality, subtle biases and stereotypes can still persist.
So even when we're consciously trying to be fair, there might be unconscious biases lurking beneath the surface.
Exactly. Those implicit biases can have a powerful impact on our choices.
So even if a young girl has a natural aptitude for math and science, she might be subtly discouraged from pursuing those fields.
It's possible. Or she might simply lack role models who inspire her to follow those paths.
And on the flip side, a young boy who's drawn to the arts or humanities might feel pressure to conform to more traditional masculine roles.
It's about recognizing those subtle pressures and creating environments that truly support everyone's unique talents and aspirations.
So it seems like this gender equality paradox, it's not a simple equation with a single answer.
It's a multi-layered phenomenon with biological, social, and cultural factors all intertwined.
Wow, this whole deep dive has really been an eye-opener. We've covered so much ground, from brain structure to evolutionary theory to cognitive differences, behavioral patterns, myth-busting, and of course this thought-provoking paradox.
It's been a fascinating journey.
It has, and I think the biggest takeaway for me is that these differences between men and women, they're not about hierarchy or superiority. It's about diversity and complementarity.
Couldn't agree more.
It's about recognizing and valuing the unique strengths that each gender brings to the table.
It's about celebrating the beautiful tapestry of human experience.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the key message you hope our listeners will take away?
I think the most important thing to remember is that understanding these differences is not about reinforcing stereotypes or creating divisions. It's about fostering empathy, communication, and collaboration.
It's about using this knowledge to build better relationships, create more inclusive environments, and ultimately make the world a more harmonious place.
That's the goal.
Well said. And on that note, we come to the end of our deep dive. We hope this exploration has sparked some new insights and maybe even challenged some of your assumptions.
We encourage you to keep questioning, keep learning, and keep embracing the beauty of difference.
Thanks for joining us.